Bootleggers, mobsters, and the shady side of Hamilton 100 years ago. That was Rocco Perri's world as he built a fortune rum-running in Prohibition-era Southern Ontario. Trevor Cole takes us there in his new book. It's called The Whisky King, the remarkable true story of Canada's most infamous bootlegger and the undercover Mountie on his trail. And Trevor Cole joins us now for more. Good to have you here at TVO tonight.
Great to be here.
Let us set the scene, because I suspect a lot of people don't remember this time or the fact that we had Prohibition in Canada and all of that. So set the scene, if you would.
Oh, wow. Which scene do you want me to talk about? Because the 20s was different from the 30s, but let's talk about the 20s. Prohibition started in 1916, lasted until 1927
Why did
Canada.
it get brought in the first place?
There was a huge wave of there was a temperance movement in the teens. Started in the States, came north. There was a huge movement against liquor. Generally it was wives wanting their husbands to stop drinking, and they became quite a force. And so politicians finally succumbed to this force and started putting in prohibition across the various provinces. And Ontario was one of the main focuses because there were so many distilleries and breweries in Ontario.
And we know, of course, in the United States, they actually amended the Constitution to bring in Prohibition.
Right, which happened a little bit later. So there was a slight an overlap of about 7 years or so.
So we've got this kind of patchwork quilt of prohibition laws in the province of Ontario back then, is that right?
Well, there was a sort of a patchwork quilt until 1916, and then it became province-wide. It would change from year to year depending on the situation. They kept changing the laws to deal with the fact that bootleggers, people like Rocco, kept finding ways around the rules.
Well, since you've mentioned him, tell us about him. Who was Rocco Perri?
Rocco was, he came over from Calabria, southern Italy, in 1904. He was a 16-year-old when he arrived, and made his way across, first into the States and then into Canada. Started connecting with what was known then as the Black Hand, which was an Italian underworld crime, sort of an organization, but more of a methodology. There were Black Hand gangs, factions throughout Ontario. He met a woman named Bessie Starkman, who was married, and wooed her away from her family. They went to St. Catharines first, then to Hamilton, and started working together as, first of all, they had a brothel. They ran prostitutes for a while. Then Rocco was into gambling. He ran numbers. And then 1916 happened, and Prohibition came, and Bessie and Rocco saw an opportunity to make a lot of money. And within 8 years from 1916, they were making approximately $1 million a month.
$1 million a month back then.
That's in 1920s money.
100 years ago, almost. Here's from your book. He wasn't a tall man, but he presented the confidence of one. He had a charming ease that separated him from the depressing surroundings, the dilapidated storefronts with their hand-painted signs in Hebrew, the horses clopping along muddy streets, the dirty children playing underfoot. When Bessie spoke, he looked directly into her eyes with a gaze that was not dull and hard like that of so many men, and this was such a refreshing change from her bread-wagon husband. He smiled. The temptation is to say these guys were the, Bonnie and Clyde of their day. You want to go there?
No, because for one thing, they were not violent people. Rocco was particularly charming, and he found a way to make things happen, created this vast network across Ontario and into Niagara Falls, Buffalo. Generally speaking, without violence. He didn't like the fact that his men would use guns, so he refused to let them use guns. Now, there were some murders and deaths early on in his career. 1922 was a particularly murderous time in Ontario. All of this connected to the Italian underworld. Rocco was involved in some of that. But he was a businessman more than a criminal, I would say.
Well, there was the king of the bootleggers, was he not?
He was a criminal, but as opposed to taking from people, he gave to people. Bonnie and Clyde were robbers. Rocco was a businessman giving people what they wanted, which just happened to be things that were illegal. But, there were a lot of people wanting to pay for good liquor, and the government didn't want them to, but Rocco was able to provide them.
There were obviously a number of organizations that were in the booze business back then, including most notably Mr. Sam, Sam Bronkman Seagram's, and he always hated the fact that people called him a bootlegger from back in the day.
Yeah, I would say he's not a bootlegger. He was a distiller who worked with bootleggers.
Okay, well, I understand the difference. But there was a kind of a legacy created by all of this, was there not?
Well, huge. First of all, politics was hugely influenced by bootlegging and smuggling. In 1926, the Mackenzie King government fell. You could say that's largely because of bootlegging and smuggling, because of corruption that was going on. There was a Commons Committee, ended up leading to the fall of the government. Then there was a Royal Commission. All of the laws that we have now regarding liquor and dealing with liquor, they all go back to Rocco's time.
Yeah, it seems kind of quaint and cute right now to think about it, but actually it was a big deal back in the day.
It was a huge deal.
Yeah. What was it about? Now, you're talking to a Hamiltonian here, okay? So tread easy here. What was it about the character of the city of Hamilton back then that made it, shall we say, ripe for a guy like Rocco Perri to do what he did?
A few things. One was they had a lot of men, a lot of immigrant men from mostly from Italy, largely from Italy. It was quite a large population in Hamilton. There was some in Toronto. There were others in northern Ontario and around the St. Catharines region as well. But particularly in Hamilton, there were a lot of factories in Hamilton that brought in a lot of men. And there was also a lot of money because of all of those factories working. There was a lot of money flowing around. So those two things combined to make that a prime area because, the black hand that Rocco sort of worked with and borrowed from, they coalesced around wealthy immigrants, wealthy Italians. So there had to be money in the city in order for this sort of to take hold.
I want to go off on a little tangent here because earlier this month there was a mob hit in Hamilton. A guy in his SUV sitting in his driveway getting his brains blown out.
Right.
And I'm so curious to know what you were thinking when you saw that in the newspaper.
Well, it's an interesting continuation of this thing that Rocco helped start 100 years ago. And there is a slight connection because the man who was killed was linked to the death of Johnny Papalia back in the 80s. Johnny's father, Tony Papalia, was implicated in the death of Rocco's wife, Bessie Perri.
Everything
in
connects.
1930, yeah.
It's crazy. Okay, we've talked about him. Let's talk about Bessie. What would you say her area of expertise was?
Well, she was the numbers person. I think Rocco really gravitated to her because I think she had a really sharp mind. She was good with numbers, good with words. She kept the books for all the various businesses that they had, and he could trust her implicitly, which he couldn't necessarily trust other gang members that closely. Also, he was an immigrant, not as adept with the language as she was, certainly not in print. He became quite fluent in it, but he wouldn't have written it nearly as easily as she did. She also had a business mind, and she was ambitious. She wanted the fruits of this illegal labor. She ended up wearing diamonds and furs, and she loved that life.
Now, you've already said that their reach went, they had business interests all the way down into the Niagara Peninsula, but how far did the tentacles reach across the country?
Well, I would say up to Cobalt in Ontario.
So way up north?
Yeah. Then later in his career, into the 30s, he was dealing with Windsor, smuggling through Windsor. And then throughout their career, they were dealing with mobsters in Buffalo, in New York, New Jersey. They were working with Lucky Luciano and Arnold Rothstein and those people.
He did something, I guess the two of them did it, which would have been considered, I think, risky and yet fascinating back then. They gave interviews to the Toronto Star. It
was fascinating. Rocco saw an opportunity. There was a journalist who came from the Star who was, I think, competing with Ernest Hemingway at the time. He wanted some of his own fame. And he figured it was time to talk to Rocco. Rocco was by that time quite well known. The Star loved, to put whatever they were up to on the front page of the Toronto Star if they could. And there had been a couple of murders recently that people were suggesting were Rocco's gang's fault. So when that journalist came to him to ask for an interview, Rocco saw an opportunity to kind of put this to rest, this idea that he was to blame for everything. And he started this huge campaign, this PR blitz, because it ended up that other newspapers came to him, and he talked to everyone and kind of laid out this image of himself as a friend of the law enforcement. And he was happy to say he was a bootlegger. He, in fact, used the phrase king of the bootleggers, which is how he became known that way. But he wanted everyone to know that he was a good guy, not a bad guy. And people lapped it up. And that issue of the Toronto Star, which normally sold for 2 cents, sold out, and people were selling copies for $2.
We're selling from 2 cents to $2.
That's right, yeah.
That's pretty good profit back in the day. You have alluded already as to what happened to Bessie Starkman, but you want to give us some more detail on that?
She got caught up in the drug racket. Bessie saw that the liquor game was on the wane. This is in the late 20s. But at the same time, narcotics was on the rise. So she wanted that action. And she pushed Rocco and the gang to that end, and it backfired on her. She got caught up in a turf war with a gang from Buffalo, and she was murdered in their garage.
How?
2 shotgun blasts to the head.
Yikes.
Yeah, they were hiding behind. Rocco and Bessie had 2 cars in their garage, a big sedan and a roadster. They were hiding behind the sedan, and when they came home from playing cards at friends, they leapt out and got her.
What did Rocco do at the scene?
Well, that's the question, because he told different versions of it to different people depending on when he was asked. He ran away from the scene, ostensibly to find help. But it was interesting that he was quite close to her in the garage. They could easily have killed both of them, but the gunman only killed Bessie. So there was the implication that Rocco was, if not responsible for the death, he knew that it was coming. And I lay out, it's a kind of a murder mystery in the middle of the Whisky King. Who killed Bessie and why?
We've got a few minutes left here, and while we've talked about one dynamic duo, I want to talk about another dynamic duo right now, because it's not just the Whisky King and his lady, but it's also the Whisky King and Frank Zaneth,
right,
the RCMP guy who was chasing Rocco for years. And let me read this from your book on him. Zaneth was a master now at slipping into identities that gave him access to exactly the information he needed. If he lacked the sexy charm that had allowed the Pinkertons operative, JCS, to seduce bootlegger Mildred Sterling into spilling about Rocco, he had other assets, a willingness to put himself in harm's way, and an ability to work doggedly until he was ready to drop. Frank Zaneth was never off duty. There is nothing this man cannot tackle, said a memo that circulated within O Division. He is a lone worker and afraid of nothing. You know, the assumption, there's a bit of, Les Miserables here, right? With Javert chasing.
A little bit, yeah.
Yeah. His life's mission to chase this guy down. But did you find similarities between the two of them?
Well, I thought it was fascinating that these two men were opposite sides of the same coin. Frank came from the north of Italy, roughly at the same time Rocco came from the south. But Frank wanted to take the straight path. He wanted to be, an upstanding citizen. He was the best of the immigrants at that time, and he represented a completely, different way of approaching life. But those paths brought these two men together. So Frank ended up in 1917 being the first undercover Mountie, and he was assigned to different tasks like infiltrating communist gangs. He dealt with narcotics in Montreal, but he ended up in the late 20s and then again in the late 30s trying to get Rocco.
Trevor, I want to finish on this because, I'm from Hamilton. I never heard of this guy. I've heard of Al Capone. I've certainly heard of Bonnie and Clyde. I've heard of Jimmy Hoffa. I'd never heard of the Whisky King. Now, you could say that about a lot of other avenues in Canada as well. We don't know a lot about some particular things. But I'm wondering if you've got a theory as to why we know all of those other hoods, but we don't know this guy.
Well, the Americans are much better at telling stories about their bad guys, and I think we should embrace this. I think this is part of Canada's past. It says a lot about the country and the formation of the country, political forces, societal forces. Rocco and Bessie and Frank were in the midst of all of that, and I think it's an important part of our past.
Glad you wrote it up and glad you came in and talked to us tonight on TVO about it.
Thanks very much.
The Whisky King, the remarkable true story of Canada's most infamous bootlegger and the undercover Mountie on his trail. Trevor Cole, thanks so much.
It's great to be here.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.